Voiceover Coffee Shop, episode number 34.
Welcome to the Voiceover Coffee Shop, where we share our morning with some of the finest names in voiceover. And now, here's your host, voice actor Andrew Morrison.
Hi there, my name is Andrew Morrison, and welcome to the Voiceover Coffee Shop, where we start our day with some of the finest names in voiceover. If you'd like to know more about me, please feel free to visit my website at www.andrewdmorrison.com. In this episode, we continue our coffee with Funimation voice actress Mellie Grant. Mellie is a script adaptor and an amazing voiceover talent who has worked with projects from Dragon Ball Super, Fairy Tail, Smite, The Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, and a ton more. In the previous episode, we talked about how she found her voice as a trans actor and her technique for anime character development. In this episode, we talk about evaluating where you are from a non-biased perspective, avoiding shoving yourself into a mold, and what goes into ADR script writing. So what have been some of, other than that character development process, what other challenges have you been facing in the VO world?
It's interesting. When I first moved down here, things I've learned really quickly. I've certainly learned that, and I didn't move down here with any kind of a chip on my shoulder. Certainly not the way that I did, the way that I had one the first time I stepped into a workshop, because I knew that I had taken 10 years off. And so I realized that beginning to explore storytelling again would be a process of reintroducing myself to things that used to be second nature and to refine those instincts. And so I never kid myself that I would be rusty, I would be scared, I would make mistakes. In fact, and you may or may not have the ear for it, but because I feel like we're always a harsher judge of ourselves. But my role in Fairy Tale of Demaria Yesta, to me, is a really great example of my learning process. I did that. I was working with Kyle Phillips on that, and it was one of my first noteworthy roles that I booked. And if you watch from my character's first appearance to, their ultimate demise, I was learning things every single episode. And so some of those early episodes are painful to me because I can hear all of the mistakes I'm making, or when I might have given a weird take that just was not remotely in character voice, at least to my ear. And we decided to stick with it because it matched the flaps, or, maybe I didn't commit enough. So it's sort of a phoned in read, and you can hear that at least I can hear that I'm more connected to it in the later episodes because I was learning something every single week. So I knew that it was going to be a challenge to kind of rediscover those instincts. But I think as someone who has transitioned, I was hoping that I was very out to everyone I knew in New York City, and moving to a new place, I had to deal with that question of how out I was going to be. And I had questions about, moving to Texas and what the culture down there was like. And fortunately, it's been a delight. But I was, as an outsider moving from a different state, I didn't know how receptive the world down here would be to an LGBT person, coming in looking for work. So my hope was that I could show up and just not ever talk about it, just show up as a woman with a huskier voice who is hopefully a decent storyteller, coming in and find some archetype that I can settle into. And mind you, I had to figure that out too, because I had taken many, many years off and I had transitioned somewhere along the way. And so my first hurdle was, I've never played women before. How do you do that? And I've always been a tomboy. In fact, one of the strangest things about transitioning in terms of my relationship to my family, who have thankfully been incredibly supportive, was I think that there is, and this is something that with communities like the Queer Box community and a bunch of my friends on Twitter, we are constantly trying to dispel these sort of assumptions and stereotypes. There's kind of the cliche story, especially of a trans woman, is that it is a child who grows up and is obsessed with Barbie dolls and wants to wear dresses and like has all of those telltale signs of like wanting to live in not the gendered world that they were assigned. And I was none of those things. I was running around the backyard, cutting up my knees, lighting things on fire, turning things into rubber band guns, and just being a menace. And so one of the first questions that I started to get from both my family and others was, you know, I don't understand how this makes sense. You always, it's all very gendered, very cliche, very, I dare say, you know, ignorant assumptions about the way humans work. But it was always that, like, you know, you don't fit any of the stories I've read in online blogs and stuff. So like, I don't understand how you could be trans. But all that is to say, a lot of those instincts wasn't there. I'm not a feminine person. I don't know how to play feminine characters. And so I started doing research and leaning into characters that I felt like maybe I could approach. So I looked at actors that have huskier voices, or actors that play stronger women. So I looked at Wendy Powell's work, and I looked at Stephanie Young's work, who's played.
She's played a lot.
Not Linda Young, Stephanie Young.
Oh, Stephanie.
Who plays Olivier Armstrong, you know, General Armstrong in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and Nisha in Borderlands, and very strong, tough female characters. And I tried to model myself around that. And I figured, you know, if I can at least find some mold I can shove myself into, I can keep hammering that nail until it works. Frustratingly, I know what my voice sounds like. Frustratingly, in lieu of people knowing my background and knowing, oh, well, that makes sense. I understand why your voice is the way it is. I ran into a lot of classes and directors and interactions that kind of politely sort of treated me like an alien. So in lieu of having that framework to understand why my voice is the way it is, I was just a woman with a really interesting, strange, deep voice that's really hard to cast. And so it was a lot harder to find my niche than I had hoped it would be. And eventually, at some point in the past year or two, I've realized I've kind of been hamstringing myself by not leaning into my masculine range as well. Like, I'm just playing with half a team on the field. And so in the past year or two, I've started to read for more and more male characters, to the point where I think there was a moment where, you know, 99% of the characters I read for would be these tough, strong female characters, which also had the side effect of I'd get auditions for anime, which oftentimes feature very tiny little teeny bopper girls. And I'd leaf through all of the characters and say, oh, there's nothing for me. Or at most, you know, maybe I can try to pitch up really high and come up with something that does not fit the archetype.
Right.
And I would skip over all the guys. Now I am trying to read for as many as I can. And I did the numbers recently, and I realized I'm now reading for about half and half male and female characters. I'm still waiting for some of those male characters to stick. And I think that's a bit of an adjustment. I worry sometimes that I might have shot myself in the foot by leading so strongly with female characters only because of the way first impressions work, that it might have been a stronger choice for me to come in the door already reading for everything than coming in like 2 years, 3 years later and being like, by the way, I'd like to try something completely different. But I have faith that if I continue to you know, to continue to play with and experiment and improve on those archetypes, that something will stick. I feel like I got completely off track. What are we talking about again?
This is perfect. You're trying to find yourself in the voiceover world and hurdles you had to overcome. That was perfect.
Strangely enough, actually, one of the earliest roles that I booked was with Okratron. Raleigh Pickens brought me in for Dragon Ball Super. And my 2 roles that I played in Dragon Ball Super were these were these larger than life, I should say, masculine leaning characters. One was very much this ultimately became this strange male, Catella, the god of destruction of Universe 4, who ultimately became this strange homage to Ren from Ren and Stimpy, mixed with Peridot from Steven Universe, mixed with a couple of other things that all lent inspiration to me, and kind of became this just like crunchy little gremlin character. And then Majikayu, who had this deeper sort of like, I let a little bit of Brooklyn. I've lived in Brooklyn a lot of my life. I let a little bit of Brooklyn bleed into that character. So if you're ever watching his scene and he has these kind of like, all right, so the big boss steps in, you're like, what is that dialect? That is New York Mellie coming to play. It's interesting. I ultimately decided that it made more sense to be more out, because I figured if a couple of things happened. When I met JP Karliak and when I started to communicate with people in Queerbox, and I started to meet more and more trans and non-binary talent who are trying to find their way into the industry, I realized on some level that it was probably a disservice for me to be so hidden when, you know, I'm not the largest profile in the world, but there is someone in the industry who's working semi-regularly, who could speak to them and who shares qualities with them. And so hiding that felt wrong. And then the more self-serving side of it was, you know, maybe if I was more out about that, and if I talked about those experiences more, then maybe I could create a framework for people to understand why my voice works the way it does, and why, you know, there are certain assumptions that we need to push back against. The idea that even if I'm a husky voice, people tend to assume your range goes a certain direction. And so I'm very regularly, I've had to teach directors that no, my range goes the other way. And so, you know, if you're bringing me in for side characters and I sound like this, you don't want to give me the 5-year-old girl as well, because I can't just stretch and get that. No, you want to throw me in with the guys, or you want to throw me, you know, the brother instead of the sister. And that's, and being able to have that information already out there and be having these conversations on a regular basis might create more of an opportunity for less confusion. So it's kind of the double whammy of like, there's a big community out there of people who I can lean on for support and who can lean on for me for support. And by being willing to teach people about me, that could ultimately create opportunities for me too, as people learn, rather than just kind of like, you know, hoping that lightning strikes, you know?
So what is your goal with your writing? Because I know you and I were talking about how you're starting, you're juggling voice acting and writing in addition to your activism.
That is most of my income at the moment, actually. And it's brand new and I'm very excited about it. One of the things that I wanted to do when I first moved down here was get into writing and adapting scripts as well for anime.
Okay.
And my first foray into the adaptation world was in the world of machinima. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am.
So machinima, for anyone that is not familiar with machinima, is typically when you'll use, for instance, a video game that has assets built in and the ability to move around and meet up with friends, especially online games, as a medium for creating stories and using screen capture software to record scenes. And I made friends with an incredible person in France who was making these full-length movies using World of Warcraft. And so I did a number of movies with this person, and every single time I worked with them, I would take on a little bit more responsibility. And initially the scripts would be very rough because they would essentially be like a Google Translate of a script that had been written entirely in French. And that led to, you know, emailing him and saying, hey, can I, do you mind if it reads a little better? Do you mind if I improv a little bit and tweak my lines so that they sound better? And that led to, you know, hey, I'm one of the 2 main characters in this animated thing. And I'm going to talk around the specifics of like movie titles and director names, because oftentimes it's a world that has very little regard for copyright. And so you'll find lots of movies that have all kinds of pirated music and stuff like that. And it's like you cut your teeth and then you sort of like move on and don't talk about it. Right. But it was a great learning experience for me, because as I continued to explore this sort of world of machinima fan dub kind of stuff, I would say, well, hey, why don't you just throw me the lines for the primary characters and I'll tweak all of them. So at least all the dialogue, sounds reasonable between like the top 3 characters. And the final project I did for them, I said, you know what, throw me the whole script and give me a couple of weeks. And so the last project I ever did in the sort of amateur machinima world, adapted the whole script. It was hard. Took me not a couple of weeks. It took me like 3 months. But I adapted the whole thing, and I learned so much along the way, because there were moments where I would realize that the joke just did not make sense in English. And I would have to kind of come up with a joke that was in the spirit of the original joke, but made sense to an English speaking audience, or if there were idioms or things that, just when you kind of colloquialized it didn't make sense in our culture, you'd have to find a way to make a parallel happen. Excuse me. And I decided, wow, that would be really cool to do an anime too. It took me years. I wanted to do it when I first moved down here in 2017, but I only just started my second show. And maybe it was arrogant of me to hope that I could just fall into Dallas and kind of say like, hey, I would like to apply for writing anime with little to no experience. But what I did do in the years before finally booking my job is I decided to try and teach myself how to do it for real. So as I would get called in for sessions at Funimation, I got very familiar with what their scripts looked like. And so I made it a personal project of mine at home to try and recreate their scripts. So I'd go into Microsoft Word, I bought a Microsoft Word license, and I started to try and figure out, all right, how many columns were there? And I think it goes, okay, so there's a queue number, and then a character and a time code, and then the line. And then on the right, there's a space for notes. Oh, but if it's an LA script, the right side isn't for notes. It's usually for the original script. So you have the Japanese translation and that script side by side. And I think that looks right. And every time I'd have a session, I'd kind of make little tweaks to what the script looked like, until I felt like I had, okay, this kind of looks like a template for an anime script. Then I thought to myself, and by the way, this is going to be a great thing to plug. I've had a lot of people since I've started writing start asking me questions about this, and it's usually too long a story to share. So I'm going to plug this to everybody that has asked me how to do this. So the next thing I did, I thought, okay, well, I'm not doing the job. No one's hiring me. So how do I practice? And how many things can I teach myself in the course of practicing? So you've got the adaptation, which is the writing of the lines. And then you've got, and the kind of colloquializing them and localizing them into English for an American audience. Before that, you've got time coding, which is the job of scrolling the episode painstakingly and finding every single moment that a human sound happens and noting the exact time signature of everything from a cough to a line to a background character's giggle. And before that, you have the translation. So before it even gets to the person who time codes it, you have the person that is translating it into a very rough version of an English script. It's like usually a direct translation of the Japanese. So what I did was I thought, okay, something I've noticed is that at least on Funimation's site, when an anime gets a dub, it will always have captions that match the dub. That's interesting. So they must update the captions. I've now learned this is true. They must update the captions to match the dub, which is something that is often done by someone called the final scripter. And final scripting essentially is the job of watching the finished recorded episode, comparing it to the script and updating the script so it matches exactly what they did in the booth. And that gets used for things like captioning. But that would mean that if a show doesn't have an English dub, the odds of it having a much rougher, bare bonesy script are a lot higher.
Right.
So I went and I found a show that had no English dub yet. At the time, I think it does have a dub now, but at the time I think I used Kaguya-sama, Love is War. And I picked that for a number of reasons. It was a very complicated show with very nuanced humor and characters that were very verbose and heady. And it struck me as a script that might be more challenging, and I was feeling myself. So the first thing I did was I watched that show and I transcribed every single line from subtitles. And thank goodness the subtitles were, no disrespect, by the way, if you're watching, no disrespect to the person that translated and did the initial captioning for the show, but they were not adapted subtitles. They were rough around the edges. So I transcribed the entire show. So now I had a document with all of those lines. And then I went through, I loaded it up into a video editor, and I started time coding it. So using that rough document with the transcription of the subtitles as a guide, I started going moment by moment, frame by frame, and logging in my little template script I'd created the time codes for every single thing, every walla cue, every react, every line. And when I finally finished that whole episode, then I went back to the top and started taking it cue by cue, just like a writer would, and adapting it into something that I made my own, and trying to match flaps and get things in and out on time, and being conscious of places where pauses happen and you have a little hitch in the flaps where they stay closed for a second, and you have to write around that. You can't just gloss over that. And excuse me, as I started to do this, and I guess because I was so invested in it, a couple of opportunities started to open up. I initially applied for a writing position with Funimation that did not work out. And as part of that application process, they had me write a sample script, and I sent it back to them. And then I had the good fortune of being able to be part of a class with an LA studio that was all about teaching you how to write and adapt anime. And by the time I was in that class, it was actually a great experience because it served as confirmation that I knew what I was doing, because I had done enough of the work on my own to self-teach that being part of that class was less about learning how to do it and more about, oh yeah, I got that. Oh, I got that too. Oh, I didn't know that. Let me write that one down. And so it was like polishing the muscles that I had already built. Problem occurred when I started to try to think about how I could find writing work. And I realized everything you do for another studio is under NDA. So my writing class in LA, all of the materials from that class was under NDA. So I couldn't share any of that classwork with anybody. The sample script I wrote for my local studio was under NDA. So I couldn't share that work with anybody. And so I'm sitting here like, am I supposed to email studios and say, hey, I can write, I swear, I promise, I have nothing to show for myself, but please trust me. And I realized I had to finish. I had not yet finished. I'd been about a third of the way in, because I'm going to be honest with you, if no one's waiting for it, if there's no paycheck at the end of it, if no one's waiting for it, self-motivation is so much harder. And now that I've done it for about 8, 9, no, it's 5, 6, let's say 8. I've done about 13 episodes now. So I'm still very much getting started, but I can get that done in a week, and I am very proud of what I turn in. But when no one's waiting for it, motivation is a nightmare for me. So it had been months, and I was only about a third of the way into the script, and I realized I had to get this done because I had no portfolio. I had nothing to show anyone. So if I get this script done, I'll have something that is my own, that can't be taken away from me. I didn't write the show, obviously. Like, I can't pass this off as something, like there are lines I can't cross when it comes to licensing. I can't really post this publicly because it belongs to a show whose license I don't own. But for the purpose of reaching out to studios, I at least have something I can share in confidence that represents my work. So I pushed myself to finish that script, and I got it done. And I finally had something of my own that I could then start sending around to studios. And I'm very happy to say none of them got back to me. And another month or two went by, and I wrote follow-up emails, and no one wrote me back. And then one of them wrote me back and gave me a very HR-y, like very hyper polished, like, thank you so much for your interest. We'll certainly keep you in mind.
Right.
Polite email. And like 2 other studios just never wrote me back. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to blame COVID because otherwise I'm going to lose my mind. And then one morning I woke up to an email from Bang Zoom. And this was when I wrote the second half of Pretty Boy Detective Club. And I guess one of their writers had to jump off or jump to a different project or something. This is how it can happen, by the way. I woke up to an email that said, essentially, out of nowhere, hey, we need to bring you on for a show. Can you start today? We need it by Friday. It was like Monday. And so I was ready to say yes. And I jumped on and I took that show. I finished that show, and they gave me another show, and God willing, they'll continue to like the work that I'm doing. And other studios will like the work that I'm doing and start to throw me scripts, because it's so much more fulfilling to be able to, even if you're not behind the mic, and I still adore storytelling, and that is my first focus, but being able to stay in the world, I think it's the reason that a lot of actors, at least out of theater school, will end up working for casting directors, or they'll go into stage management, just to do something that keeps you in the world that you're focused on. So I'm still doing creative work, and I'm expressing myself creatively, and I'm paying my bills now with creative writing. And it's so much more, I don't know, to me, it's a more efficient way to be making money and paying my bills, because I'm still thinking about the work as I'm writing, I'm practicing the lines, and it helps me keep my eye on the ball than if I were working at a retail store or a restaurant or one of a number of things. I think there's a lot of power in finding a way. And I know it's not possible for everybody, but there is a lot of power in finding a way to make your side gig also something that's part of your main focus. And you know, that could be directing. I want to direct at some point. I would love to direct, but for me, that's writing right now. And yeah, came out of nowhere, ready to say yes, did the work up front, not to sound like every one of those really angry, you know, Twitter motivational posts,
Right.
but did the work up front, was ready to say yes, because sometimes that stuff just happens really fast. And you know that if I had said, hey, let me get back to you, they would have probably just tossed it to somebody else. But
Right.
because I was able to write back immediately and say, yeah, I'm on board, let's do this. I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm not going to say that to you. Let's just see if we can make this happen. And all of that preparation led to that opportunity.
So what do you do outside of the booth? I mean, I know you're very creatively focused and you're very determined, and you put your backbone into it, but every once in a while we do need time outside of the booth. What do you do to kind of recharge yourself? What do you enjoy, Mellie? You video
I
games?
play a lot of video games. You know, the weirdest thing about adapting to a writing schedule, and I think because my work ethic is still probably atrocious, I don't have time for anything during the week anymore. I don't play games during the week. I wake up usually late. I'm on a weird rotated like second shift, third shift schedule where I'm like falling out of bed at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and I'm going to bed at like 5 in the morning. But I will write all week, and there's no time to play anything. There's no time to watch anything. Inspiration comes when you least expect it. So oftentimes I'm kind of just like spinning in my chair for half the day, and then a moment of inspiration will happen. And then I go back to spinning, trying to figure out what the hell to do, you know, for the next cue. But man, those weekends are great. I've been playing a lot of, I've played Destiny 2. I love that game. I've been playing not Borderlands, Black Desert Online lately. Watching stuff is weird for me. I used to go through binges of shows, and I find that it's strange. I watch so much anime now as part of the working process. You know, if I'm in a show, I won't be able to hear you for a second, but if I'm in a show, I'm watching every episode that I'm in. I'm usually watching things again after they air. If I'm writing, I'm watching every episode many times by the time that script is in. On the weekends lately, I've been proofing scripts for captioning, which I mentioned earlier. So I'm watching those shows as well. I don't watch a lot for pleasure lately. You know, once in a while, I might go through like a CW Arrowverse show or something that's like very, you know, not anime, but still create, you know, fulfilling to my imagination. I don't watch a lot of movies. It's weird. You know, before I was working in it regularly, I consumed a lot more. And I know I'm not the only person that says this, because I've talked to a lot of other actors that say, yeah, now that I'm acting, now that I'm directing, doing X, Y, and Z, I don't watch anything for fun anymore. I'm either, you know, some people, you know, spend their free time working out. Some people spend their free time playing video games. Some people do both. I've been doing a whole lot of the video games thing lately. I think it's because it gives me the ability to interact with the story and kind of exert some of my own control over it. And that's always been fun for me. I think that's kind of what makes video games so appealing, is that it's a story that you can kind of have some of your own agency in. What else do I do? We have an amazing, adorable, she's not in here. My housemate Mark has an adorable little cat named Bunny. And I spend a lot of time with her. She's just the best, most amazing de-stressor in the universe. When the weather gets warm, I like to take walks. I don't know if you're into hot weather. I am like the only person I know that adores the hotter the weather, the better. And so Texas summers, which are usually in the 90s to 100 range, I'll get out there in the sun and I'll walk for an hour or two, put on a podcast, you know, or something I can listen to that I can kind of mark time with. And I'll usually go outside and say like, all right, am I going to do 1 episode or 2 episodes? And I'll just stay out there walking until I'm done. There's a little track nearby actually that I'm torn on the concrete thing. And maybe it's because the last time I was on a track, it was like an indoor gym situation where it was rubbered on the ground. And I feel like when I'm walking just on solid concrete for 2 to 4 hours, it just starts to wreck my legs by the end of it. But yeah, going out there and taking walks and just kind of trying to get outside, get a little sun. Yeah. God, so much of it has been work lately. And I realized that like that in a void sounds a little bit like a humble brag, but a lot of it's just been writing, you know. I would love to be buried up to my neck in acting work, but the work when you're writing, so much of that is what you make of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a benchmark I probably hit early in my week where I could be content with the work that I submit and it would probably be serviceable, but I'm definitely still, hopefully this is a phase you don't grow out of. I'm definitely still in that phase where all of this work is really precious to me and I want it to be as good as I possibly can make it. I want it to read as well as I can because that works really well for people that are watching. Mm-hmm. But I also want it to be a great experience for my actors that get into the booth. I want them to get in there and not be puzzling over the lines or the phrasing. I want it to be something that rolls off the tongue and makes their job as easy as possible. So I'm probably putting a wild amount of time into each one of these scripts. And I've talked to a couple of my peers that also do it. And I've been very reassured to hear that the first year or so that you're writing is often a process of kind of finding your work ethic and finding ways to be efficient while still turning out a product of the same quality. So I'm trying not to be too hard on myself when I put in like a 60-hour week and lose my mind and I'm sleep deprived and like, it's going to get better. I'm going to get better at this as we go. Everything is a process of learning and getting better and improving your process. I'm just in the beginner stage right now and I'm just happy to have the gig.
Right.
That's a lot of this. I feel like that's a lot of this business. It's just like being happy to be here. Mm-hmm. and being grateful for the opportunities that you are thrown. And you know, and you need, gosh, we need some of that positivity. It's so easy to get caught. And I'm a victim of this all the time, get caught being frustrated and cranky and tense over the things that we don't have control over. And boy, especially as someone who has spent half my career getting told, you know, I don't know how to cast you by people. Mm-hmm. And so I'm constantly fighting that uphill battle of like, as a storyteller, just being like, I'm an actor, like you throw me anything and I can play with it. I've been doing this since I was a child, but you have to find breaks from being tense and angry at the world and find ways to just kind of like slide into your pleasure. And one thing I've noticed, especially with the writing side of things, is even when, and it might just be because I'm, you know, it's all my own, you know, creative work and decision making. It even when it's not my show and I'm sticking to someone else's script and there's a client breathing down my neck that wants specific things to be just so, enough of that is still my own voice coming out on the page that even when it is a nightmare and it is stressful and I'm losing sleep, I get to the end of the week and something I've noticed is that every single one of those scripts that I've turned in, I've been super proud of. And I felt really good at the end of every week. And so I need to, and something I'm always working on, because I think especially with acting and the hurdles I've run into, it's very easy for me at least to fall into a dark place with that, is trying to find ways to translate that energy into the storytelling side of things too, and be like, all right, there are things I don't have control over and I need to learn to not stress out over that, not let that dominate my week, shove that to the side, enjoy the things that I'm being thrown, because they're going to be more, and find joy in those and end my week feeling good about that instead of feeling bad about some other thing I had no control over. And I say this as someone who is very much a work in progress with that. Like, you can find panels of me where I'm just angry for 2.5 hours. And it's still a process of, because I also don't, and maybe this is the New Yorker in me, like I don't like BSing people.
Right.
I like being honest about how I feel about things. If I don't like it, you can read it on my face, no matter what words come out of my mouth. And so I don't want to be I don't want to be somebody who makes everything into a super positive saccharine experience, because that doesn't feel authentic to me as well. So we have to recognize the places that stuff's bad, but make sure we're taking time to appreciate the places where things are good too, because otherwise you're just going to be angry and insufferable all the time.
Right. So if you were to write yourself a letter back to New York and you were to like send that back in time, what would you tell your old self before you got wrapped up into this whole world?
Ooh, transition sooner, first of all. I don't think there's been a detriment to transitioning late. People are gonna, follow the path that's in front of them at their own paces, and something I'm learning, and you have to keep reminding yourself, is that you're never too late. It's very easy, especially for someone like me who comes into this industry at like 30 instead of 20 and is working with directors that are my age, not, my parents' age or whatever.
Right.
There's a lot of adjustment there where it's easy to kind of feel like you're too late and you're playing catch up for the rest of your life, and you're stressed out and that you're kind of like permanently dealing with some handicap, which is, a terrible mindset to have. And I mean handicap in kind of like the gaming sense,
Right.
Not the physical sense, but but at least speaking to myself, I think transitioning sooner, being less afraid to be myself and find myself, so that I possibly could be in a more self-assured place jumping into this, and not be, still feeling like an imposter half the time when I'm doing this work. My goodness, how often I spend in the booth doing auditions that take me way longer than they should, because there's always that voice. I think I learned recently from a friend, they call it gender noise, where you're, I'll read a female character and there's that voice saying it sounds too masculine. And then I'll turn around and read for a male character and that voice is saying it sounds too feminine, and it just self-sabotages. And I feel like if I had, twice as much time under my belt post-transition, just living as myself, being confident in who I am, that those are muscles that would be more developed by now. So transition sooner. Oh my goodness, my life, I've always been relatively comfortable, and I was very ambitious in my last job. So I earned my way to a place where financially I was comfortable, and I was not suffering for anything, but I was not happy. And I would be so much happier, so much sooner, if I had just kind of followed that calling and became myself sooner, rather than stressing about it and dealing with all of those fears that I think were more pertinent, at least societally, back then, because there were less people talking about it, less people like us having these conversations. So it just felt like something you couldn't do. It was impossible. And my goodness, I love how much more we're talking about trans and non-binary issues these days, because if I'd had the resources that I'd had back, that I have now, that people have now, that I'd had back then, who knows what would have happened. I probably would have found my courage sooner. And also, I don't know, the savings thing and the job thing created a lot of really positive experiences for me. And I think I moved down here. I was a little nervous at first, but I think I've grown into a more self-confident person sooner. I've learned to trust my instincts and share opinions when I disagree with something. And I've learned that it's okay, even if the director is the one that ultimately makes the final decision. I've learned that it's okay to have a difference of a creative difference of opinion. Where oftentimes we're kind of stuck in this zone of feeling like the director is your boss and they could fire you at a moment's notice, and you're kind of just like a kid clocking into a summer job, kind of worried that everybody hates you. And I think that I've found myself sooner, as a result of having worked for like a multi-hundred-billion-dollar company for a decade, I trust myself a little bit sooner than I might have otherwise. But I might tell myself to jump in sooner, and to take the leap sooner. I think that a lot of years went by where I knew the right move was to move down here or move to LA and to try and make it happen. And I resisted because fear is, a real thing. Change is scary. And it's easier to mitigate a job that makes you miserable. Somehow it's easier to do that than it is to take a chance on something where you don't know what the outcome might be, and going into it not knowing if you're going to be, at least back then I wouldn't have been financially ready, and I might not have been psychologically ready or emotionally ready. Would I have had the support system? I don't know. But I kind of say this I take it with a grain of salt, because like our paths are our own, and I'm exactly where I need to be right now. But hindsight is 2020, and if you want to kind of have a sense of humor about it for a little bit and kind of play with it, everything would be sooner, because I know that I'm so happy with where I am now that, man, it would have been great to have just done this sooner. Yeah, sure, transition sooner, quit the job and move sooner and give it a shot sooner. But at the same time, because I know that the letter to your former self can often devolve into like sort of regretting past mistakes and stuff like that. I don't dwell on it, because I'm not that person, and I'm here now, and all I can do is the best I can now to continue to follow my instincts, worry about the controllables I can control instead of the things that I can't control. And then of course that juggling, that careful juggle of speaking up about the things you care about, but not letting them ruin your life. Yeah, do everything sooner, but also like don't sweat it, because your life's going to go where it needs to go. One thing I would say for people, if there are people that are listening that have kind of been bitten by the bug of the creative life and they want to follow it, but they don't know how, definitely, if you haven't already, find friends that you can share that passion with, because so many things in my life have come out of having conversations and having places. I mean, even a therapist would be an amazing gift to give yourself, because it gives you the ability to talk out loud and process out loud and find the things that matter to you most. And that can be friends. Some things need a therapist, but when it comes to the creative life, finding friends you can talk to that share that passion, that you can voice those ideas out loud and come to your own, come to conclusions that you're not going to get to if you just keep clocking in every day and kind of wishing on a star. Like you need to find a community that shares that interest, because I think that'll help bring things into focus and help you decide if you should be doing this, if you should be going after this, or if it's something that can stay a hobby and that can be a very fulfilling hobby for you, or something that maybe you aren't meant to be doing, but taking the time to actually talk through it with people and process it. Because I can tell you, for one, I spent so many years with nobody to talk to about acting, storytelling, voiceover, and not having that support circle. All it did was delay everything. So finding people, jumping into things like, your voice acting clubs and Queer Vox, and finding communities on Twitter and other social networks where, you're really finding people that you can be vulnerable with and share those fears and concerns and get advice and ask questions, because that's how we grow. We grow by lifting each other up. When you're stuck in a void, there's like one in 100 supermen or women can lift themselves up and propel themselves to the moon, but the rest of us have to, all lift together.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope that this was beneficial. I am such a long-winded person that I know that I am prone to tangent city, but I've wanted to do this for a while, and I'm glad that we had the ability to work it out, because I know scheduling can be tough sometimes. So it feels good that we finally managed to find some time to have some coffee together.
I really hope you enjoyed listening to how Mellie turned her passions from voiceover and ADR writing into a full-blown career, and how she used that to empower the change she wanted to see in the world. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Voiceover Coffee Shop. For more information on guests, new episodes, and more, be sure to visit www.vocoffeeshop.com.